I've had the chance to talk to thousands of college students around America, and whenever I ask people what is the number one argument against the existence of God in their minds, you want to know what comes back almost every single time? That's right. It's evil. The evil and suffering we see in the world today. But does evil disprove God? Let's talk about evil and the evidence for God. In this video, we'll look at the intellectual problem of evil. Actually, there's two intellectual problems of evil: the logical problem and the evidential problem. Now, the intellectual problem of evil, we need to understand, is distinct from the emotional problem of evil. And a lot of times, this is where our friends really are when we engage with them about this problem of evil and suffering and how God can be involved in the world when there's so much tragedy, so much horrible things that we see people doing to one another. The emotional problem of evil is really where people are, but they oftentimes feel like their problem is actually intellectual. So we want to take a look at the intellectual problems of evil and see how these don't disprove God. And in fact, they point us directly to God. And the answer to the problem of evil many times is not so much doing apologetics with people in terms of answering these logical objections, but sitting with them and moving into kind of a pastoral counseling position, because a lot of our friends are really hurting. And those are the people who express some of these concerns about God intellectually. And we need to be able to understand when people are really hurting personally, and so we can respond in the appropriate way. But we'll see that these intellectual problems really don't disprove God, and these really aren't the main problems that people have when they object to the existence of God based on evil. So here's how the challenge goes. The challenge says something like, it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. All right, that's the logical problem of evil. The logical problem of evil says that it is logically impossible for God and evil to coexist. But nobody's ever been able to show an actual contradiction between these two statements, that God exists and that evil exists. And so there's got to be some kind of implicit idea that's smuggled in here. And so one way you might see this laid out on paper is something like this. Number one, if God is all-powerful, he could destroy evil. If God is all good, he would destroy evil. But evil is not destroyed. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, if you take a look at this logical problem of evil the way it's written out here, you'll see that the conclusion actually doesn't follow from the premises. And you find this expressed in a variety of different ways in the popular culture, through books, through movies. Here's one way that Sam Harris, a really popular new atheist author, expressed it in a letter to a Christian nation. He says this: if God exists, either he can do nothing to stop the most egregious calamities, or he does not care to. God, therefore, is either impotent or evil. Now, I want us to see how this really isn't a very good argument for atheism. You know why? Because if God is real, but he's too weak to do anything about evil, then atheism is false. If God is real, but he's too evil, he's actually an evil being and he doesn't want to do anything about evil because he actually is evil, but he's real, then guess what? Atheism is still false. And so this really isn't a very good argument for atheism. And like I mentioned earlier, many people have an emotional problem with the existence of evil and tend to talk about intellectual problems because either one, they feel like their problem really is intellectual, or two, they feel like they've never gotten a good answer from a Christian to the intellectual problem of evil. But the thing I want you to see here is that the problem of evil often has to exploit these national tragedies, these horrible things that we see in the world, in order to make the problem look like it's a challenge to the existence of God, and that atheism is a more plausible worldview. But in fact, this is not a very good argument for atheism. It does have to rely on the emotional problem of evil for all of its capital. So, is God either therefore impotent or evil? This is guilty of what's called a false dilemma. A false dilemma. Now, what is a false dilemma? A false dilemma is kind of like if you went to the Jelly Belly factory and got one of those joke boxes of jelly beans where, one is like, this one tastes like an ashtray and this one tastes like wet socks. Which one do you want to try? Well, maybe I don't have to choose the wet socks. Maybe I don't have to choose the ashtray flavor. Maybe there's a third option, right? And the third option is you can pass on your sick, disgusting jelly beans, and I'm going to take out another jelly bean, one that tastes like strawberry cheesecake or something. So a false dilemma is where an argument presents you with two options and it looks like you only have two options, but really there's a third option there. There's at least one other option that's snuck in. And this is what the problem of evil is like in the way Sam Harris brings it about. Atheists don't want to say that God is evil. Atheists don't want to say that God is impotent. They don't want to say God's real at all. That's what atheism is. Atheism is a denial of the existence of God. And ironically, Sam Harris himself shows us that there is a third option by proposing the atheist option. Not that God is real but evil, not that God is real but impotent, but that God does not exist. So he says the biblical God is a fiction. Now, if there's a third option, you think there could be a fourth one too? Actually, yes. And that is the Christian response to this problem. And here it is that God can have good reasons for allowing evil. It is possible for God to have good reasons for allowing evil. So long as it's even possible for God to have good reasons for allowing evil, the logical problem of evil fails. And it's been widely admitted by philosophers that this logical problem of evil has been defeated. And you can look more into this using the writings of Alvin Plantinga, who really brought this to the forefront. So, could God have a good reason for allowing evil? Yes. Well, if so, what might that reason be? What might those reasons be? God may have a multiplicity of reasons for allowing this or that instance of suffering in the world, and we may never know all the reasons why God allows this or that in the world. But just to show that it is in fact possible for God to have good reasons for allowing evil, I want you to remember one word, and that one word is love. I want to say love. I almost want to say, what's love got to do with it, right? What's love got to do with it? That's a song, an old classic song. But if you remember that idea, that love shows us that God can have a good reason for allowing evil. Why? Because he gave us freedom so that we could love. God wanted to create free creatures who could freely choose to love him for real. Because real love can't be forced, right? You can't force someone to love you. Even an all-powerful God can't force you to freely choose to love him. It's a logical impossibility. Love has to be freely given, or else it's not real love. And so God gave us freedom so that we could love. And by giving us freedom so that we could love, God, you could say, made evil possible. God made evil possible by giving us free will so that we could love. But by giving us free will so we could love, it also made us possible to not love. It also made it possible for us to choose to do evil. God made evil possible, but we made evil actual. Evil came into the world. Human evil is an example of human beings using their free will badly. And so you could say that God made evil possible, but it is human beings who made evil actual. We choose to use our freedom in wrong ways. And when the goodness that should be there is removed, that's what we call evil. Well, okay, maybe it's not entirely impossible that God and evil can coexist, but the second challenge comes about, and this is the evidential problem of evil. And the evidential problem of evil says, okay, maybe it's not impossible, but it's extremely unlikely that God could have good reasons for allowing evil, mostly because of the kinds of evil we see in the world today and the amounts of evil that we see in the world today. But what can we say about this? Is it really so unlikely? Is it really extremely unlikely that God could have good reasons for allowing evil? I learned a little bit about this when I became a dad. I had to take my little boy when he was a baby to the doctor to get some shots, and my wife and I were going to be missionaries in the Philippines, and so we had to get our little baby some shots, not just for being a baby, but also for living overseas, so he would be protected from some diseases that you could encounter in the third world. And so we took him, imagine this, I put the little onesie on him, and I picked him up, and he was like, oh yeah, we're going out, where are we going, Dad? And I took him to the hospital. I slid my credit card and paid the copay. We got in there, the nurse laid him down on the bed, and they shot him up with 2 injections in each leg simultaneously. Oh, he cried. I cried. I was the one holding down the little legs of my baby while they were inflicting some very real pain on this less than 1-year-old person. And my little boy was looking at me with these eyes like, why are you helping the bad people? Right? They're hurting me. Can't you see? Can't you see what they're doing? Now, just because my little baby had no idea, he had no clue, that he would be protected from some serious diseases as we moved overseas, he had no idea that there was a good reason that my wife and I wanted to allow some real pain into his life for 2 or 3 seconds, right? Just because he had no idea that there was a good reason didn't mean there wasn't a good reason there. And so there can be good reasons that God has for allowing evil, even if we don't know what those reasons are. God can have good reasons for allowing evil, even if we don't know what those reasons are. Why should we expect to be able to plumb God's mind and understand all the reasons he allows evil? I think about myself. I'm this little person on this tiny little planet in this huge galaxy, right? This huge universe. We don't know everything. Why should we have to imagine that we had to figure out every single reason why God would allow evil? So long as it's actually possible that God could have a good reason for allowing evil, the logical problem of evil fails. And with this illustration, we can see that it's not extremely unlikely that God could have a good reason for allowing evil. God can have good reasons for allowing evil, even if we don't know what those reasons are. But if all you look at is the evil in the world, people say, it really makes it tough to believe in God. I would agree. If that's all you're going to look at, then yeah. If all you want to look at is how people do horrible things to each other, it does make it pretty hard to believe in God. But is that all the data that we have to consider? I mean, the evidential problem of evil doesn't take all of the data into account. Why think evil is the only thing that we should look at when we're trying to weigh all the evidence to see if there's more evidence that God exists or if it's more likely that God exists or not? We have arguments from the existence of the universe, the Kalam argument, the Leibniz argument. We looked at the design argument for intelligent design in the world and the design of the constants and quantities that we see in the world today. So even if you didn't know what to do with the problem of evil, you could still be fully justified in believing in the existence of God. So the logical and the evidential versions of the problem of evil don't disprove God. Actually, they point us straight to God. You know how? Because they have to admit that evil is real. They have to assume that evil is real. Because if there's no evil, then what is there to complain about? There would be no problem of evil if evil didn't exist. And so having objective evil implies objective good. Having objective evil implies objective good. That is, you can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good. And here's why. Because you could have a standard where nothing falls short of that standard, but you can't have something that falls short of the standard without a standard, do you understand? And so when we see the absence of good, that's what we call evil. Augustine said that evil is the absence of good. It's kind of like a donut hole, but not a little ball of dough with sugar on it, but like an actual hole where there should be a donut, and instead of more donut, there's just a hole there. When the donut that should be there is taken away, there's a hole there, right? So when the goodness that should be there is removed from a family, is removed from a relationship, we say these things are evil. They're examples of evil. So evil itself is not a thing. Evil is the absence of good. And C.S. Lewis wrote in Mere Christianity that he understood what right and wrong were because he understood that if the universe seemed so cruel, so unjust, the only explanation for that is that he knew that that's not the way things should be, right? There is a should. There is a way things ought to be. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? Then he writes, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. This is like the idea of the shadow proves the sunshine, right? The shadows prove the sunshine. That's an old Switchfoot song. So the intellectual problem of evil doesn't disprove God. The logical version points us to God, and the evidential version of the problem of evil points us to God as well. Here's how Norman Geisler restates the problem of evil in light of this. He says, if God is all-powerful, he can defeat evil. If God is all good, he will defeat evil. But evil is not yet defeated. Therefore, God can and will one day defeat evil. Jesus is very, very real. The Bible is very, very real when it comes to the problem of evil. Jesus said, in this life you will have trouble. Jesus said, if they hate me, they're going to hate you too. And so the problem of evil is something that we see that we are actually supposed to expect evil in the world, expect suffering in the world. But Jesus also said, take heart, because I have overcome the world. Thanks for joining us in this conversation about evil and the evidence for God.